Hyper-V is Microsoft's hardware virtualization server role on Windows Server. Now, this has been around since Server 2008, but each version of Windows Server from 2008 to 2008 R2, 2012, and so on, each version has a different version of Hyper-V in it. Hyper-V has a software layer that is just generically called a hypervisor. Well, Microsoft calls theirs a hypervisor. That hypervisor is the software that runs within the operating system that allows you to access virtual machines, allows virtual machines to run, and make sure that the virtual machines can have access to the physical hardware in your computer. Nearly any operating system can be ran. You can run Windows operating systems. Now, when I say supported operating systems here, what we mean, you could install Windows 2000 and it would run as a virtual machine, but that is not an operating system that Microsoft offers support for. So you could install it and it would run, but if you had an issue with that operating system or that virtual machine, Microsoft no longer supports that operating system. So that's all I mean by the supported Windows versions. If you want Microsoft support, the OS has to be a supported OS, but it'll truly run nearly any version of Windows. You can run non-Microsoft operating systems like Linux, CentOS, FreeBSD. They can all run as virtual machines within Hyper-V itself. Now, with Hyper-V, you have Server 2019. You can install the Hyper-V role on the server. That loads that software layer. Then we can run our virtual machines. This could run some server OS, 2016, 2019, 2012, whatever OS you want. Another VM could run some version of Linux. They could coexist without any problems. You could run client operating systems. So if I wanted a Windows 10 virtual machine, you could run a client OS like that, or even Windows 7. In general, the Hyper-V features can be grouped in these categories. Management and connectivity. That's going to be our next focus. Just managing the virtual machines themselves and managing the Hyper-V role and the settings within Hyper-V at the server level. Portability. Just the ability to move, I'm going to say move/migrate. Since these are virtual machines, you could move these from one Hyper-V host to another. You could move them from your on-premise environment to the Azure cloud. So very portable operating systems. So portable, on my laptop running Windows 10, I could actually install Hyper-V in Windows 10. Windows 10 does support Hyper-V. I could build a virtual machine on my laptop. I could then take that virtual machine and I could actually move it to a Windows Server 2019 Hyper-V server and it would run just the same. Likewise, if I built a virtual machine in server, I could actually just copy that virtual machine to a USB drive or something and copy it over to my laptop and it would run on Windows 10 without any problems. Disaster recovery and backup. There are some specific capabilities we'll see related to Hyper-V for disaster recovery. Security is always a concern. One of the main concerns is who has access to the host. So this is our host OS. All the virtual machines live on that host. The virtual hard drives, the configurations, the data. So who has access at the host level? If you have network administrators, if you have people that are responsible for backing up the host, if you have storage administrators, just making sure you limit what they can manage on the host, how they can connect to and manage virtual machines, just to make sure we are not over-assigning permissions and rights. And lastly, optimization, making sure these run as efficient as possible. Now, a fun fact, Microsoft says one Hyper-V host can run 10,000 virtual machines. You're not going to ever do that. That, Microsoft says, is the limit of the software. Our limit, our practical limit, is actually resources. How much memory, storage, like capacity and speed, CPU power for processing, These are really the practical limits. And we can't say what they would be or what's recommended that you use because it depends on your virtual machines. If one of these virtual machines runs a SQL server, one runs Microsoft Exchange, they consume massive amounts of resources. I may have another that runs Linux, and it only consumes a few megabytes of RAM. So you can't just say, oh, if you have a certain amount of RAM, you can run 5, 10, 20 virtual machines. Depends on what they do. And even knowing what you're going to install, like SQL and Exchange, you can get some baseline recommendations from Microsoft. It'll say, oh, an Exchange server should have at a minimum this amount of RAM. That's a baseline, but it depends on how you use it. One company may have a SQL server that uses 64 gigs of RAM, that actively uses it. Another company may have a SQL server that uses less than 8 gigs of RAM. Depends on how the server is utilized and what resources it needs. But those would be the way we can think of these grouped together. Actually, our planning kind of fits into these categories. To run Hyper-V, there are just some basic requirements that you have to meet. And any server you purchase is going to meet these requirements. You need a 64-bit processor. All servers are going to come with a 64-bit processor now. And the operating system. Windows Server 2008 R2 and newer only come 64-bit. So a 64-bit processor and a 64-bit operating system. Sufficient memory. We can't say what that is. Now, Microsoft says at a minimum you should have 4 gigs of RAM. All servers in an actual environment would have far more than 4 gigs of RAM. But it really depends on what you intend to do with it. But at a minimum, 4 gigs. Now, a number that low would only be relevant for a test environment, where you have some old computer laying around and you just want to know if you can put an OS on it and then load Hyper-V, 4 gigs of RAM. Our processor has to support some type of virtualization technology. Intel has their Intel VT, which is just virtualization technology, and AMD has their virtualization, which they call AMD-V. Now, your computer may have these, but it may have to be enabled in the BIOS or the firmware on the computer itself. It's often disabled. Just have to enable it, then you can load Hyper-V. Now, before you go tinkering around in the BIOS or anything like that, the easiest thing to do to make sure you meet these requirements is to go to the run box and type msinfo32. That's going to bring up your system information, and that's going to tell you if you meet the requirements for Hyper-V. It's literally going to say yes or no. You meet or do not meet the requirements for Hyper-V. So you'll know. If you need to go to the BIOS and enable your virtualization, it will actually tell you that as well. If you cannot run Hyper-V for some reason, you don't meet the requirements, it will tell you that as well, and you just know it's not going to happen for you. Now, when I want to install Hyper-V, the 2 ways to install it. Just go through Server Manager and install it like any other role or feature. It's going to be in the list. You can also use PowerShell. This install-Windows feature, just choose PowerShell and you can install it directly from the PowerShell command line.